What model should I use? Should I use Claude? Should I use Kimi? What's the best model for the brain? How about subagents? If you stay to the end of this video, I'll break down exactly the pros and cons of using cheap and expensive models, best models I've found for using OpenClaw, and the various approaches you can take to have the best setup for your own OpenClaw AI agent. On top, if you stay to the end, I'll show you some free approaches you can use with your OpenClaw so you're not spending a ton of money in token usage. Without anything else to say, let's jump right into the computer. What model should you use to run your AI? So let's get right into it. I feel like I get this question all the time. Now, just for context, I'm burning a bunch of tokens. I've burned over maybe probably right around 1 billion tokens in the last 30 days alone. And this is just on an open router. It's not on say Google AI Studio or any of these other platforms where they're also counting the tokens. I've kind of seen many things, you know what I mean? What works, what doesn't work. Now, in the beginning, from the OpenClaw hype, everyone, what they were doing is they were trying to use their Claw subscriptions, getting a OAuth token or access token to pretty much run the OpenClaw on it, right? Because if you have Claude powering OpenClaw, this thing's powerful, you know what I mean? And then pretty much just uses your rate limits and say subscription plan to run it. But unfortunately, Claude, I think it was in the last month, sometime in February, they updated one of their policies where now they don't allow that, you know what I mean? So now the only way you can access Claude through OpenClaw is by using their API key, you know what I mean? So it's going to cost you more, and that's probably what they want, you know what I mean? People found these loopholes, everyone was upgrading to the max and the pro plans, you know what I mean? And then at some point they just said, nope, we don't want this. We want subscribers to only use our chat and our products. And if you want to use the API, then you have to pay as token or just the API usage. So that was like the hack everyone was doing, you know what I mean? Because you're running pretty much Claude on this thing. It's one of the powerful agents out there. The problem though is when you're really starting to stack up and use Sonnet or say something like Opus, this thing can really rack you up a bill. Just a simple prompt can cost you, with Opus, right? It could cost you somewhere between 50 cents, like 25 cents to like 75 cents, you know what I mean, with Opus. Whereas, say if you're using something like GPT-5 Nano or something like that, it can cost you a third of a penny, you know what I mean? Very, very cheap, or maybe even cheaper than that. I'm just trying to be a little bit generous here, but sometimes it could be extremely cheap. So that was pretty much what everyone was doing in the beginning and why some people were running this thing on Claude. However, now it kind of switched out to be where now you have to kind of be more intentional in terms of what you're choosing. Now here, I'm just going to lay out 3 providers that I personally use and I suggest. I'm not saying these are the best ones. I'm not saying you should just only use these. There's tons of providers out there, especially if you go on a tool like OpenRouter, you simply get their API key. By the way, we're going to get to that in just a bit, like where should you be sourcing these models and what provider you should do. We're going to get to that. And anyway, now when it comes to using cheap versus expensive models, there's always going to be pros and trade-offs. The pros, if you're using the most expensive models, is you're pretty much getting the frontier AI labs, AI research, so you pretty much run your operations. You know what I mean? Especially if you're using OpenClaw to run, say, a marketing department by having its own, say, sub-agent team, or you're getting this thing to code and perform really high complex tasks that requires you to have like the most optimal and high performing intelligence at the front of it, then you need a super frontier model. You know what I mean? So Claude is probably the way to go. We're using some of these new frontier models, supposedly the new GPT 5.4, which was pretty much designed for OpenClaw because they recently just acquired the founder of OpenClaw. They've been shipping things like crazy too. They've been updating their user interface for the OpenClaw dashboard. So they're really betting a lot of their resources on OpenClaw, and I'm sure like their agents, the future of their agents are going to get way, way better. Their codex, the recent codex was really, really good at coding, you know what I mean? So just because like you don't see a certain provider here doesn't mean I don't suggest them. Like if you're choosing or for instance, if you're choosing for say some coding models, Claude and Codex 5.2, I haven't tried 5.4, but they're amazing for coding. You know what I mean? Every single model, if you're trying all these models and you're using pretty much everything, you're using the same prompt across various different models, you're gonna kind of feel what is the best model for what. You know what I mean? Like right now, if we were to say something about image generation or something like that, then maybe say something like Google Nano Banana 2 or ChatGPT Image 1.5. They're some of the best models out there right now for image generation. You know what I mean? Especially Grok. One thing about Grok, sometimes people sleep on it, but if you want quick image generation, if you want this thing to quickly move in and out text or update text, this thing's fast. You know what I mean? So the way you're going to figure out what to use what for you just have to kind of like feel everything out, get a sense of it, put your hands on it, spend some money on it, and then you'll kind of know like, okay, for cheap tasks, let's run this. You know what I mean? For something fast, let's run this. For something more intelligent that needs to kind of anticipate my needs without me trying to verbally describe what I want or say I have to type it, you know what I mean, in a very specific way, then use a more expensive model because they're literally built to anticipate your needs, you know what I mean? One big constraint when it comes to actually working with AI is our ability to express what's in our mind with our ideas with our prompts, whether you're speaking voice or through voice to your computer so it can pretty much read and understand your prompt, or if say you just have or you give it a lot of context so it understands what you want. The biggest trade-offs that I've realized that when you're using expensive and cheap models is that for the expensive models, they can anticipate your needs. Like if you've ever tried Opus, this thing can really anticipate your needs without you even being like very clear and precise in terms of what is it that you want. It'll look through its own context. It'll go and figure out something online, what to do. It'll try a few things of its own. You know what I mean? So it's just gonna do things where it kind of blows your mind. Whereas say you use something more cheap, the trade-off is you have to be kind of more specific. It may hallucinate. It may do something stupid you don't want it to do. So you have to give it more constraints, more rules, more do's, more don'ts. You have to kind of let it define, or you have to define for it, like what does definition of done mean? Not to say that you shouldn't do this for say something that's more intelligent or more expensive, but you have to kind of like feel everything out and kind of see, because from my experience from using both expensive models and cheap models, I personally like nowadays just like to use my Claude subscription for say working in the Claude desktop to do specific things, because I'm just using my plan. Where I say for something like OpenClaw, if this thing's running millions of tokens every single week, then I'm probably going to use a cheaper model, and models specifically built for like agentic tasks, tool calling, sequences of steps it has to do in order to accomplish a task or whatever it is. So that's where say something like Minimax or Kimi come into play. Now, how exactly is it that tokens work? Because when people ask like, hey, what model should I provide? Okay, why should I pay this? Why is this thing so expensive? Whatever. Well, you have to understand that the way these AIs work and operate is through tokens. So they generate tokens to predict the next word because they are language models, and they're just predicting the next word in the sequence of like the generative text and say code and math in order to give you a reply to your prompt. So tokens are pretty much like the fuel that these AIs run on. So there's always like whenever you're looking on any of these AI providers, there's pretty much a input cost and a output cost. So if you look here on my screen, whenever you are like comparing various different models, there are these various different like pros and cons of it, their context lengths, whether they have reasoning enabled or not, what's their latency like, and then when it comes to pricing, let's understand the pricing here, because the way these are all like these APIs, the way they charge you is through millions of tokens, right? So for instance, if your prompt with whatever you're providing it context with, whether it's searching its own context or memory, whether it's a massive file prompt, whether it's an image prompt, or whatever you're feeding it, these are all input prompts, right? And then it's pretty much tokenized. So then that would be your token cost. So whatever amount that equates to in terms of characters that you're providing to it, that would be the token cost. And then when it's actually generating you a reply, it takes generations and tokens in order to generate you a response. So you'll tend to notice that the output that the AI is providing for you is going to tend to cost more. So for instance here, Opus costs $25 to give you an output, whereas say a Minimax M.25 costs you $1.20 to put out. Whereas say for a GPT 5.4, which they just released, cost $180 per million tokens. Now, I haven't used this thing, so I don't know whether that's worth it or not, you know what I mean? But you can see here that all these different providers here have different token costs for whatever model you are running on. And the thing is, like, especially too, if this thing's starting to compact, the questions, or I'm sorry, the conversations are getting really long and it has to start to cache the conversation, then sometimes what these providers will do is based on like, say, after a million tokens that have been cached, then the output response is going to cost you even more. Same thing with the input. So these models have these various different like tiers in terms of how they price, but this is just in short a TLDR, how kind of like the pricing and the API usage works when you're choosing any model to run your AI on, whether it's on OpenClaw or anything else. And tokens in short, pretty much they determine the cost, the context size of like how big your chat windows can be before it has to compact, or you have to start a new session, or the model just will not let you have any more conversations with it because it's just kind of ran out of space. And then the speed, right? Because if it takes a lot of tokens just to generate your response, the latency might be slower. Now, a lot of people, what they see online when they're working with these agents is how some people are setting the brain for their primary orchestrator agent with, say, the most intelligent model, and then their sub-brains or, say, sub-agents with, say, a less important, or I guess you can say, a more cost-efficient model. So the way it kind of works is because you have this main orchestrator agent, which is the primary agent that you're talking to, whether it's on your phone, whether it's in the chat, whatever it is, this is the primary main agent, they call it, right? This is the main agent. If you want this thing to orchestrate and spawn agents properly, execute tasks properly, know exactly what to do, then you probably want to run this thing with a better model. But in the beginning, I don't recommend you start having all these complex flows and stuff like that. Just pick one model that's reasonable for your budget and then just talk with it. See whether or not it makes sense for it to be a main orchestrated agent, or if you want to upgrade or downgrade because it's either costing you too much or you need something that is more cheaper. In the beginning though, just set one model, something cheap. I recommend usually Minimax M.25 because it's pretty much built for agentic flows, tooling. It doesn't hallucinate as much as, say, Kimi. Kimi, in my opinion, is good sometimes with the responses, but once the context and the conversations become really, really long, it starts to hallucinate and just kind of giving you just answers that quite honestly suck. And sometimes it's just slow, whereas, say, Minimax is way faster. But the way, in short, the way you want to think of like brain and task delegation is that when you're setting the main agent in an ideal setup is usually the best performing AI that you can afford, that's within your budget, and then you can be comfortable with talking to all the time, right? Whereas, say, if you are creating sub-agents or other tasks for your scheduled jobs to be done, or schedule, or say sub-agents that can be spawned by the main orchestrator agent, then say what you want there, you want something that is more cost efficient. Like if you're going out there to do a research task, then maybe you don't want your Minimax or, say, Claude to do the task. Maybe you want to equip the sub-agent with a API provider like Perplexity, one of those Perplexity models, one of those Exa models, say Parallel AI, or hook it up with a skill that has access to Parallel AI. You see what I mean? Because when you hook up certain models that they're most optimized and specifically created for, you are pretty much putting in the seat like the person with the main focus of like what they were designed to do. You know what I mean? If you're using, say, like Codex, you should probably create an agent that is specifically using Codex because it's really good at coding. Whereas, say, if you want something that is really good at being the brain, the orchestrator behind everything, it can follow prompts exactly, it can anticipate your needs, and if you really need like a strong thinking companion, then probably go for Claude. But if you want something that is main, multi-purpose, can pretty much do anything, you can pretty much run it on any AI provider out there, right? But in the beginning, because this thing's going to run up millions of tokens, I suggest, especially too, if you're hitting rate limits on some of these providers online, I suggest just use something like Minimax where, say, you can hook up an API key on OpenRouter, you can add some credits into there, and you don't have to worry about like the tier billing systems, like say on Google AI Cloud, because sometimes if you're using like Google AI Cloud, you'll run into these tiers, these rate limit tiers, and then you're pretty much wondering why is this thing crashing, because it's really, you are hitting your rate limits in terms of like tokens per minute or tokens per day or whatever their limitation is, and you can't go beyond that, especially if you're hitting like millions of tokens every single minute or something like that. When you're trying to create like these like really long flows, it'll just crash. So I just suggest OpenRouter to like prevent that problem, but I digress. Here, if you are in the OpenClaw dashboard, when you go to the Agents tab, they just updated it literally today as I'm doing this video. But the way it looks like is you go to your main agent, and then you can pretty much select it, and then you can pretty much pick and choose your primary model. It's not that hard to do. If you have access to the dashboard, all you really have to do is just select the primary model. Ideally, you also set a fallback model because sometimes this thing can crash. Maybe it's just out of service right now. Maybe the AI provider or whatever, or wherever they're sourcing the provider from on their platform, something happens to them. In case it crashes, you don't want this thing just to crash on you. Have a fallback, you know what I mean? Whether it's a cheaper model, maybe from another provider, maybe from a separate API key, but always have like a fallback, you know what I mean? And then, this would be the primary brain of the orchestrator agent. Whereas, say, if you have more sub-agents, so this is like a lead agent, I have this agent pretty much going out there and prospecting for me with emails. So what I do here is, for instance, I mean, obviously I don't have it saved to Grok, but just for this demonstration purposes, I set it just to Grok, you know what I mean? So you can pretty much delegate. So whenever I'm spawning this agent for scheduled tasks, or say the main orchestrator agent is spawning it for some specific reason, the main primary brain that would be running this thing would be on Grok. But in this case, for lead and prospecting, I probably don't want Grok, you know what I mean? But just as an example. Visually speaking, just so you understand like conceptually like how this looks, you have the primary orchestrator agent, there are these sub-agents. These sub-agents, they have their own brains. Like these are all just brains and intelligence at the end of the day. It's like, who's running that brain? You know, what's under the roof? So if we say we have Claude here, Claude's running the primary like the brain of everything, right? It's the composer here. Whereas you have sub-agents where, say, one's a researcher, one's a builder with code, and then the last one, say, it could be, I don't know, something general purpose like a ChatGPT model. All of the models have their pros and cons. You just kind of want to feel them out, know what you want, and pretty much just delegate the brains to that. Or you just pretty much just have one main agent running everything. But if you just want to be as cost efficient as possible, then the best way to go is to kind of do some due diligence research between what agent is designed for what, and then pretty much pick and choose the brains for each agent. In my opinion, the best API provider for everything here is OpenRouter, because you're literally just getting one API key. You have access to hundreds and hundreds of different AI models that are always coming out. And pretty much you could just top up your tokens or your credits, and then you'll just be billed on activity and usage from the platform. So rather than having dozens of different API keys from different providers where, you increase your exposure to security risk because you have more API keys that can easily get hacked, stolen, or whatever. And what happens there is you have to manage all these keys. You have to remember them. Some of them might be expired. Some of them might have to be rotated. But here, if you just have OpenRouter, you literally just have one API key where you're sourcing the API providers for the different brains. So they have like hundreds of different models, you know what I mean? And then you can just pretty much flip out, pick and choose the model you want to run for your main agent, for your sub agents, whatever it is. I always recommend OpenRouter. Now let's quickly talk about just free approaches in terms of how some people are running on their setups free AI models. Now, the thing is, there's two approaches here. So if you are pretty much self-hosting this thing on your own machine, or you're running this in a virtual private server, and you are just trying to be as efficient as possible, ideally in a free world, or ideally in a world where everything's pretty much free and you're getting the best bang for your buck where it's free, then what you want to do is check out OpenRouter. If you go on OpenRouter and you look at some of their free models, you will find some pretty interesting deals. So right now I'm on OpenRouter. I pressed Command F, went to models, and I just I typed in free. So sometimes they'll have these promotional offers where they have various different models for free, right? And usually it's just a promotion, right? So right now we have this Nemotron, and keep in mind, some of these AIs, they're not just general purpose AI. Some of them are just embedding models. Some of them are for something else. So here, let's see what this is. So honestly, I'm not entirely too sure what this is, but it might be something for, people are using it for programming, so it's being ranked there. But let's see if there's any more free ones. If you look down, there's this one Step Fun right here. This thing's been free for a bit. There's another one free for a bit. So you can pretty much just like come into here, press copy, and then just go into OpenClaw, set the model to this model from your OpenRouter API key, and then boom, you have access to it for free. Now, the one con I want to say about this is that while they are free, a lot of these are experimental. Some of them, just by simply agreeing to use with them, it does pretty much collect your data. So you also have to be careful about that. There are some trade-offs because it's a promotional offer at the end of the day. They're probably trying to learn about their users and whether or not their product works. And that's just a trade-off you have to be aware of. But some of these models, they don't always do that. So just kind of be aware. I think OpenRouter will make a mention of that, especially if it's free. I think this one actually had it. So you see right here, there's like a little mention that they suggest not to include sensitive information. Now, the other approach through this is having your own personal machine running a local model. So whether it's a Mac Mini, whether it's your personal computer or some other piece of hardware you have, and then what you can do there is pretty much just set up or download a open source model, let it run on your computer, and then use its own CPU and GPU to pretty much cover the token costs. The trade-off is you have to have a pretty strong machine, because if you're using some pretty big parameter models out there, it's going to eat up a lot of your computer's resources. So that's the only trade-off. At the end of the day, you're getting free tokens. And whether or not there are really good models out there or not, I personally haven't tried the local models, but this is how some people are doing it. They're downloading it on their computers, and then from there, they can pretty much just access these models for free. It's just using your computer's resources, and that's pretty much it. But that's the video. Wanted to share some thoughts and opinions on what you want to pick when it comes to choosing the best model for your AI agent. In this case, OpenClaw, but I'm pretty sure this idea that I kind of shared here applies to anything that you're working with when it comes to agents. I hope you found some value from it. If you'd like more information and more useful tips and tricks around AI, you should check out my newsletter. I share free stuff every single week. Just go to my website. Otherwise, appreciate you watching this video. Subscribe for more, and I got a bunch of more videos like this coming out. See ya.